but that's all I know. Like, I am sorry, your Wi-Fi is not great. Okay, so while we are finishing that up, just a friendly reminder that your exam number 2 is due tonight at 11:59. So I gave an exam to general psych, and without fail, the next morning I had 2 people frantically emailing me saying, can you please open up the exam again? Don't let that be you. So if you need me tonight, feel free to shoot me a message on the Discord or shoot me an email. I've given you an hour and 5 minutes to take the exam, so I give you 15 extra minutes, so hopefully that helps. There is a recording of the review session that we had on Monday, so I would encourage you, if you haven't watched it yet and you want to prepare, go ahead and watch that now. I hope this shouldn't be too difficult of an exam, but again, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. This thing never leaves my side. I might potentially have a problem, but when it comes to answering your emails, I'm pretty quick. Okay, so you haven't had to watch it yet, but I did spend a little bit of time talking about concepts and categories in a special video that you can watch. By the way, is anybody surprised by the fact that an olive is technically a fruit? Well, it is. So are coconuts and avocados, and yet we would never put them in a fruit salad. If you put olives in my fruit salad, I will look at you and go, please take it back.
Some people at my job, we have weird salads and they'll put avocados with fruits. So
I mean, I can kind of get down with that because depending on when you get an avocado, it doesn't really taste like anything. But I don't know if I could put an avocado in my fruit salad. I saw different types of avocado toast, and they were basically like, we're going to put strawberries on it. I'm like, ew, just give me some everything bagel seasoning on top of that, and I'm great. So something that I kind of asked you to do is I asked you to draw me pictures of dogs. So a few of you did. So I tried to open Tori's so that I could save it to the desktop, but Tori, I'm really sorry, for whatever reason, the computer won't let me download your drawing. I do have a question for you based on the dog that you drew. This is a dog that one of our other students drew, and I was able to download that. Oh, if not for that fuzzy little tail, I would almost think that was Smedley as a puppy down to the red collar. Now we do have another drawing in class. I'm gonna see if I can angle the camera so that you can see it really quick. So I'm gonna stop screen share so that hopefully you all can see this if you're zooming in. I can pull out a little bit, but not much more, but you can kind of see it's a big round dog with happy little ears and things like that. So here's what's kind of interesting. Of the drawings that people actually did of dogs, what I find especially interesting is that every single one of them is different. So right now, and you didn't have to draw it for me, but if you went and looked in your mind's eye, so go ahead right now and think about a dog. Think about a prototypical dog in your mind. So can anybody kind of tell me what they came up with for their prototypical dog? So I've already seen Maya's, and I've seen Tori's, and I've seen Robin's drawing. For those of you that did not draw, if you're thinking about a dog right now, what does your dog look like? Yeah, Emma.
it has floppy ears.
Okay, big floppy ears. So how many of you imagined a dog with floppy ears? How many of you did not imagine a dog with floppy ears? Okay. Anybody else? How many of you have a dog in mind, but it doesn't actually look like any particular dog that you've ever seen? Okay. All right, so a few people. So when we talk about these different types of concepts, we are talking about what is referred to as a prototype. And we also have examples of what it means to be a dog. And one of the things that we're going to find is, at least in my personal perspective, part of the reason that everybody has a different type of dog in mind is because you all have different examples of dogs. So for those of you that have grown up around smaller dogs, your prototypical dog's going to be pretty small. So Tori, in the chat, I noticed that your dog kind of looked a little Chihuahua-ish. I don't know if that's what you intended, but can you tell me in the chat what kind of, if you've ever had a dog, what kind it was? Because it kind of looked a little Chihuahua-ish to me. It had little pointy ears and a tiny little tail. So while you're doing that, we're going to move on to talking about those prototypes and those exemplars. So what is a prototype? And yes, we have to have a cute puppy. I'm pretty sure that is either a pit bull puppy or a Boston Terrier puppy, and I love Boston Terriers very much. So when we talk about a prototype is a central description or a conceptual core that includes major features of a category. So typically, this will look like a list of features or attributes. So when we talk about a prototypical dog, the way that prototype has previously been described is that it's not so much an image in your mind. It's a list of features or it's a list of attributes. So can somebody tell me what the typical attributes of a dog are? Can somebody name me a typical attribute of a dog? Oh, thank you, Tori. Our current dog is an Aussie Chihuahua mix, which might explain the pointy little ears that you drew in yours. So your experiences influence the type of dog you draw. And I think that's pretty important. But when we're talking about a prototype, we are looking at something that will technically not match any dog. And here's why. So there are dogs with little tiny ears, bigger ears, and then big floppy ears. And then you have basset hounds whose ears like go all the way to their little legs. So what we're going to do, so we have all of these different types of ears. We're going to take the average, which no dog has. We're going to look at things like snout length, and we're going to take the average, which no dog has. We're going to look at the size. So we have tiny little dogs, we have medium-sized dogs, we have large dogs, we have dogs that look like horses, and we're going to take the average of that, which isn't going to match any particular dog. We're going to look at paw type. We're going to look at leg length. We're going to look at tails. And here's the thing. We're going to try to basically take the average and look at what the most typical attributes are. And because we're basically taking an average of all possible dog attributes, what this means is that these attributes of this prototype do not match any dog. Now, here's the thing though. So you have some dogs that are average in size, they're average in their ear length, they're average in their snout length, they're not too big, they're not too small. And the closer that that dog gets to the prototype, the more likely we're going to think of that as a dog. So it's why usually when you ask people to think of a dog, for most people, a dog like a Labrador Retriever is going to come into mind. That's a pretty average dog based on this list of attributes. But that doesn't explain why, when I ask people to draw dogs, everybody's dog looks different, and it's usually based on their experience with dogs. So here, how do we determine category membership? So yes, more cute dogs. That's a cute Chihuahua. I like that. So is a Chihuahua a dog? Huh? Yes, it is. A Chihuahua is absolutely a dog. It's just not what we often think of as a prototypical dog. So what we're going to do if we want to figure out if something is a dog, we're going to check the attributes of that of the concept. So we're going to look at the different attributes of the Chihuahua, and we're going to match it up to the prototype. So we're basically looking for what are called family resemblances. We're looking at these areas of overlap between the prototype and the attributes of the current concept. If y'all want to see a really interesting dog that does not look like a dog at all, one of the types of dogs that my partner and I were thinking of getting before we got Smedley was a Xolo. And that's a shortened version of its name. If you've seen Coco, and you know that little black dog in Coco, that's basically a Xolo. They don't have hair, or they have very little hair. And we were thinking about getting one of those, but they're really hard to find. I'll show you a picture later, I promise. Okay, so generally what we're going to find is that category members that have higher family resemblances are going to be a lot closer to resembling that prototype, like a Labrador is. And a Labrador Retriever is the quintessential dog, at least here in the United States. It is one of the most popular dog breeds there is. Generally, typical members of a category will have more family resemblances than atypical ones. So a Labrador, or trying to think of another common dog, a Labrador, a Golden Retriever, a Beagle, they're going to have more family resemblances than something like a Chihuahua, or something like a Great Dane or a Great Pyrenees. I made sure to get like the tiniest dog and then the biggest dog. Or a Chinese crested, which is often referred to as, typically makes the awards for the world's ugliest dog. I don't think they're that ugly. You just have to take care of them. They don't have a lot of hair. Okay, we good? Oh, I'll have some bubbly for a second. The mango one is good. Okay, so here are the problems with prototypes though. Generally, family resemblances don't really work very well for goal-derived categories like birthday presents. So how many of you love getting like sentimental gifts from people, from family, from friends, from potential romantic partners? And then it turns out that the person that you're expecting a gift from is absolutely a practical gifts person. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sentimental and schmoopy. I do not like practical gifts unless I specifically ask for them. Although I will say I got a treadmill last year. That didn't bother me at all. So one of the things we're going to find though is that for each of you, you have your own family resemblances for what a prototypical birthday present should be. But what you expect is going to be incredibly different from what another person expects. There are some of you that would love a gift card. There are some of you that would absolutely hate a gift card. So for goal-derived categories, this really doesn't work incredibly well. And I just realized my ponytail fell out. So I will fix it while I talk. Okay, additionally, one of the things that's kind of interesting, we've spent a lot of time, both on the video that I taped and so far, talking about typicality. So when I ask you to think of a typical fruit, you're going to name things like an apple, a banana, things like that. You're probably not going to list something like a pineapple or dragon fruit or a persimmon or something like that. Experts, though, Do not use typicality to judge category membership. People who work for the American Kennel Club dog show or the Westminster Dog Show, these people are experts and they don't necessarily need to use typicality to determine whether something is a dog or not, or whether it is a certain type of breed of dog or not. So for example, there is one other person in town, I believe, who owns a dog that is the same breed as our Smedley. And we walked by them, and it turns out that they've gotten Vizslas before, and they basically said, your dog's not pure Vizsla, is it? And we're like, no, it's not 100% Vizsla. How did you know? And the person was basically like, well, he has a really square head. And I'm like, okay. So that's a case where this person is clearly an expert, and they're going to not be judging typicality. They're going to be looking at these finer detailed attributes like the size of the dog's head to determine if it's a member of a certain class. Novices don't even use typicality. Novices use familiarity. Have I seen a dog like this before? Then it's a dog. So that's just kind of something to keep in mind. And really quick, for those of you that are kind of curious, because I'm mentioning dog breeds. So really quick, if you haven't seen my dog, this is a Vizsla. Very cute. Actually, that's a wire-haired Vizsla. So these are Vizslas. And then this is a Xolo, or Xoloitzcuintli. That definitely does not look like a typical dog, and some of you might not find them attractive at all, but I thought they were kind of cute. Okay, so it's kind of clear that this prototype approach doesn't really work very well, and it also doesn't fit with how people actually do these things. And generally, I'm going to say that a theory or an idea is only as good as whether or not people actually use these in real life. So it's kind of clear that when we're trying to judge whether something is a dog or not, we're doing something very different than coming up with a prototype. And this is where your dog drawings come into play. So rather than focusing on whether or not something fits a prototype, it has been argued that the way that we figure out whether or not something is a dog or whether or not something is a fruit is by using an exemplar approach. Every time that you encounter a dog or any type of dog, you store large numbers of examples. And this is less abstract than attributes, where it's got a typical ear length and a typical snout length and a typical tail length. That's all very abstract, and it doesn't actually match any dog that exists. But you can think about all of the times that you've seen a dachshund or a chihuahua or a golden retriever or beagle or things like that. So this actually gives you images, which makes this a little easier. The evidence that we have for the exemplar approach comes through the explanation of typicality effects. So when you judge something as being a typical dog, your judgment of how typical something is based on evidence that you've stored. Generally, more typical members of a class will have more stored examples of them. So when we're thinking about fruits, maybe you're a lot like me and you're always interested in trying new fruits. So I tried a dragon fruit the other day. It was really good and also very expensive. I like persimmons. I like pomegranates. I like all of these weird different types of fruits. And that might affect whether or not I judge those as typical fruits. But you know what I have a lot more memories of? Apples, bananas, pears, blueberries, and more typical fruits. So the frequency of these exemplars will affect how we judge members. So this is really important. There is a personalized approach here. So if you are like me, and you grew up in a family that had certain types of dogs, you're going to judge those dogs as being more typical because you get more exposure to them. So I grew up in a family where Boston Terriers were constantly running around the house. So when I see a Boston Terrier, I have more examples of those. That is going to influence what I think of as a typical dog. Now, on the other hand, if you've grown up with smaller dogs, that's going to affect your typical dog. If you grew up with Great Danes, your typical dog is going to be the size of a tiny pony. I love Great Danes, though. They're huge. So the frequency will affect how we judge members. So the reason that most of you draw a different dog is because you've had different exposures and different experiences to different types of dogs. The same is true when we're judging typical fruits, when we're judging typical birds, etc. I'm probably going to be more apt to think a flamingo is a bird than any of you because, well, I grew up in Florida and it's not that hard to find flamingos. So our experiences influence what we judge as being typical or atypical. And that's why I had you draw dogs, the end. So this also, by the way, preserves the variability that naturally exists within a category. Dogs vary in many shapes and sizes and types and behaviors. And so this allows us to keep that variability instead of taking the average of all members and basically creating this amorphous, like proto dog that doesn't actually exist. Okay, now here let's talk a little bit about some of the issues with the exemplar approach because no theory is perfect. Generally, this isn't going to work well with very simple concepts like chair. Can I sit on it? Then it's a chair. Generally, for very, very simple concepts, we're going to look for commonalities with the concepts similar to prototype. So when we're talking about a chair, which we tend to not think about as much as we think about dogs in terms of complexity, like chair is a much simpler concept than a dog. We're going to look for commonalities such as horizontal surfaces where we can put our posteriors and have them possibly elevated or at the very least stable. So we're going to look for some commonalities and look for the average. In this case, we're basically going to revert to prototype theory for a really simple concept. More complex concepts, though, like dogs, presents, birthday party, are going to require examples. Oh, sorry, I got too excited. And also, if you are on campus and you see the Smedley, say hello. And yes, I do call him the Smedley. It's kind of like calling it the Batman. It makes it sound more serious and more fun. All right. So now we're going to move on to another type of semantic memory known as schemas and scripts. So I think I'm going to start before we move on to this because I think this could be useful. And I know you're just chomping at the bit to hear about our homework assignment. So I think I'm going to do it right now because this might actually fit a little bit with what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to tell you a story, and this is a ghost story. So in the interest of trying to lighten the mood and have a little bit of fun, especially in these weird pandemic days, and since you won't be able to rely much on my facial expressions to help you because mask, I'm going to turn off the lights and light my face up with a flashlight while I tell you this scary story. Don't write anything down yet. I don't want the blinky. There we go. Okay. And yes, I'm going to keep laughing like that at different points in the story. The war. So by the way, folks, this is for your homework assignment on Friday, so make sure you listen good. The War of the Ghosts. One night, two young men from Egulac went down to the river to hunt seals. And while they were there, it became foggy and calm. Then they heard war cries, and they thought, maybe this is a war party. They escaped to the shore and hid behind a log. Now canoes came up, and they heard the noise of paddles and saw one canoe coming up to them. There were 5 men in the canoe, and they said, "What do you think? We wish to take you along. We are going up the river to make war on the people." One of the young men said, "I have no arrows." "Arrows are in the canoe," they said. "I will not go along. I might be killed. My relatives will not know where I have gone. But you," he said, turning to the other, "may go with them." That's a good friend right there. So one of the young men went, but the other returned home. And the warriors went up the river to a town on the other side of Kalama. The people came down to the water and they began to fight. Many were killed. But presently the young man heard one of the warriors say, "Quick, let us go home. That Indian has been hit." Now he thought, "Oh, they are ghosts." He did not feel sick, but they said he'd been shot. So the canoes went back to Egulac, and the young man went ashore to his house and made a fire. And he told everyone and said, "Behold, I accompanied the ghosts, and we went to fight. Many of our fellows were killed, and many of those who attacked us were killed. They said I was hit, and I did not feel sick." He told it all, then became quiet. When the sun rose, he fell down. Something black came out of his mouth. His face became contorted. The people jumped up and cried. He was dead. Okay, so you've heard the story. Here's how you do Friday's homework assignment. What I'd like you to do is I would like you to basically remember as many things as you can from that story. Try to put it in the order that you heard it. Basically, I want you to try to recreate that story. Don't do it until later this evening at the very earliest. And then make sure that you send me your retelling of the story by Friday, okay? Does that sound pretty good? That wasn't really very much of a scary story, and as we're going to talk about on Friday, some aspects of it are a little weird, but that's all part of the plan. Okay, lights are coming back on. Ready? Yes. Wouldn't it have been really funny if I had turned into a bat while the lights came on? Unfortunately, that would mean I'm a vampire and I can't teach your class anymore, so thankfully, I'm not a bat. All right. So now we're going to move on to talk about schemas and scripts. So interestingly enough, when you heard that story, Some of those instances feel like they're all a part of a plot or a narrative that you've heard before. So when you hear that something is a ghost story, for example, and this is definitely the time of year for ghost stories, there are always really interesting things that you expect from a ghost story. You expect it to scare you, surprise you. You expect it to shock you. So you have this idea in your mind about what happens in a ghost story. You actually have a schema for a ghost story. So what is a schema? So a schema, we've already kind of talked about this a little bit. It is an organized packet of knowledge. So we last talked about schemas when I showed you the picture of the teaching assistant's office by Brewer and Trayans. So remember I showed you the picture and it had all of these different items in the office, but there were no books. And students, when presented with this picture of a teaching assistant's office, often falsely recalled books being in the picture when no books were actually present. So a schema is basically an organized packet of knowledge. So when we talk about what we expect to happen, for example, what a criminal looks like, we all have a schema in our mind of what a criminal looks like based on experiences, either ones that we experience personally or through exposure to different types of media. So for example, we'll talk about this more when we talk about eyewitness testimony. And it's a very, very common schema for a criminal to be male. So if you're imagining a criminal right now, odds are pretty good you are imagining that criminal as being male. I like to imagine he's got a really bad 5 o'clock shadow and he's got like a hook nose. He kind of looks like Gargamel from the Smurfs. It's kind of weird. But we assume that a criminal is likely to be male. So interestingly enough, when you have to watch a video of a crime where the criminal's gender is basically not present, they're basically covering up their face with a balaclava, many people falsely recall that the criminal was male, when in fact you'd have no way of knowing that. Your schema influences how you interpret information and how you remember information. And you can also distort information that is basically in favor of your schema. So something that's kind of related to a schema is a script. So a script stores time-based information about typical events. So I realize this schema doesn't work as well in the pandemic, but for those of you who were here on the Cotty campus last year, tell me the sequence of events for the dining hall. So getting lunch in the dining hall, tell me the steps.
Grab your tray.
Okay, grab your tray.
On the tray. Ask for your food, get your drink, and sit down.
That's really quick. Did anybody have any steps that are missing? How about stand in line for a really long time? Show them your ID, because I have to. Give them your lunch card. Stand and wait in line and get annoyed while students take forever. My script. Have I mentioned I get hangry a lot? Like students are like, I want that. I'm like, you don't have to have everything. Dr. Gilchrist is hungry and she has class at 1 o'clock. If I have such a problem, I should get there earlier. I know. But let's say, for example, that you know that sequence and you go to visit another college campus and they have a dining hall just like Cotty's. Not exactly like Cotty's, but it's different. Now, are you going to basically lose your mind and go, oh my gosh, it's a completely different dining hall that looks completely different from Cotty's. I have no idea how to navigate this. Yeah, somebody said yes. Oh, well, that's okay. But you'd still ultimately have the same sequence of steps, and maybe some things would be different. So for example, I remember when I was interviewing on different college campuses, I went to interview at Appalachian State, and they actually showed me one of the dining halls. And it turns out this dining hall has like multiple different stations in different parts of the building for different things. Not unlike Cotty's, but the buildings are obviously going to be bigger. So they had one whole area for desserts, and it was called Treat Yosef, because their mascot's name is Yosef, so treat yourself. But you should be able to at least get most of the basic steps down. You're probably going to be standing in line. You're probably going to have a tray. You're probably going to have silverware of some kind. You're probably going to have to wait for food or indicate what kind of food you want. And then when you're done eating, at some point, you're going to have to bus your tray and find a place to put it away. Generally in colleges, we don't take away trays for you. You have to do that yourself. And so regardless of where you go, your script is flexible enough that it can work in a variety of different situations. So for example, let's say that a new restaurant opens up at Nevada. Could it please be Panera? Yeah, I know that's never gonna happen, but I'm like, I want Panera. I want Panera bad. But if we went to a new restaurant, you wouldn't go into that restaurant and not know how to navigate it. Now, let's be clear. Restaurants are all really different from each other. Sometimes you pay before you eat. Sometimes you pay after you eat. Sometimes you have to wait for a seat. Sometimes you grab what's ever available. Sometimes you're at a food truck and you're getting takeout. Sometimes you're dining in. Sometimes you'll be there for 20 minutes. Sometimes you'll be there for 2 hours. So when we look at a script, what really is important with the script is that it's flexible. So a script is often going to be made of what are called frames and then what we call slots. The frames provide an overarching, unchanging structure. If you go to a restaurant, you're going to get food, and I hate to break it to you, somebody's going to have to pay for it. I've never been to a restaurant where you eat food without paying. I'd like to go to that restaurant, but it would probably be out of business in a week because nobody paid. So clearly there's food, you might eat it there, and at some point you are going to have to pay for it. That's the frame. That's what a restaurant is. But these different slots, when you pay, whether you're eating inside, what kind of food there is, do you have to bus your own food? All of those are flexible and can be moved around within the frame so that you can navigate your world more easily. That's why these scripts exist. They give you an overarching structure so you're not completely paralyzed by indecision when you're encountering something new. Your previous experiences help you navigate these situations more easily. So why are these helpful? Scripts and schemas are helpful because they help us form expectations. And additionally, this is where I very helpfully remind you something I taught you on the first day of class. We are cognitively lazy people. If we can have a simpler way to navigate our world, we are going to do that. So especially if we're busy, if we're tired, if our attention is not where it needs to be, if we're hungry, if we've had a really bad day, scripts and schemas can help us navigate our world without overloading our finite cognitive resources. And they also help us fill in knowledge gaps. So I've never actually been a victim of a crime. Like, somebody stole my bike once when I was a kid, but I never saw who did it. Otherwise, I've never been the victim of a crime. However, when my partner told me he got mugged once before going to an Incubus concert, I had a pretty good idea of what that must have looked like, because I have a schema that can help me fill in the gaps that I otherwise would not have. Additionally, they can help provide us with assistance with visual scenes. So one of the things that we find is that when you are in a kitchen, it's easy to place objects in expected places. So if I have a cup, we actually find that people noticing that a cup is in a scene, you actually have an easier time with it when it's in a place that you expect. So on a horizontal flat surface like a countertop. If a cup is hidden elsewhere in the scene where we wouldn't expect it, it's harder for us to notice. So our schema of what belongs in a kitchen can actually help us with expected objects, especially if they are in areas where we expect. Also, information that doesn't really fit our schema really stands out to us and is easier to notice when it's in a kitchen, like a shark toy. I don't know why the shark toy is in the kitchen, but there you go. Okay. Does anybody need me to go back? Okay. So schemas can bias and distort our memory. We have to talk about one big real life way that schema also will create biases. They are a way that we have stereotypes. So stereotypes are oversimplified generalizations about certain groups. Now let's be clear. These stereotypes can be positive or they can be negative. But what's important here is even a positive stereotype neglects the opportunity for us to see a person as an individual, and rather we are basically assigning oversimplified characteristics to this person because of some group membership. So for example, and I'm going to keep this really innocuous. So I'm from Florida. What's your stereotype of Florida people? Huh? Old? Huh? Crazy? That Florida man always doing things. Now, so here's the deal. If you have a stereotype about Floridians, and some of you might, because the news makes it easy, and also because it's Florida, they don't pay a state income tax, so you get lots of people who are looking to dodge taxes. Yikes. Not to mention the Everglades is completely overrun by pythons. Yeah, it's an interesting place. But if I tell you that I'm from Florida, all of a sudden you might have an idea about me, not based on anything other than the fact that I said that I was from Florida. Does anybody have another example? So, and let's keep this innocuous. Let's keep this more to like, what state do you come from or what kind of job do you have? Yeah, Robin.
I'm from East Tennessee, where Dolly Parton is. So like I have the southern backwoods.
So you're Southern.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the mountains.
Okay. Ah, Appalachian people. So what kind of stereotypes do they have for people that are in Appalachia?
Barefooted overalls, flannels.
Barefoot overalls, making moonshine,
Yeah,
blowing
yeah,
into a
just-
jug.
Yeah.
Probably kind of racist, a little bit sexist, backwoods, don't really know a lot about things. Hey, if it makes you feel any better, my grandparents are all from West Virginia. I come from a very long line of coal miners. So I know all about the Southern stereotypes, absolutely. So we have these oversimplified generalizations. And so so we've got some good news and we've got some bad news. So this is especially true when we are talking about issues related to marginalized groups. So when we're talking about issues related to race, country of origin, class, LGBTQ, so sexual orientation, gender identity, and different things like that, generally overt explicit stereotypes are decreasing. So I actually pulled this up. This is a percentage of white participants basically selecting a trait to describe Black Americans. And so what you can kind of see based on this survey data is that in general, that overt explicit stereotypes are decreasing over time. So percentage of white participants who report being willing to admit Blacks into various relationships, employment in my occupation. Here's what I find kind of weird when I look at these percentages. Why is it 98 in 1968 and really we are not even at 100% in 1992? That's kind of weird. My club is personal friends, my street is neighbors, marriage, and you can see that in general, people are reportedly becoming more open. Now, here's where this is critical. You know it's not a good thing to be racist. You know it's not a good thing to be sexist. That it's not good to be a homophobe. So here's the thing. People lie on surveys like this. So it is possible that in fact, yes, overt explicit stereotypes are decreasing. Is this because we are more tolerant? I would say in a lot of ways, yes, we are. I would also say we have a lot more work to do. We ain't done yet. And I would also say that some of this is probably due to social desirability. We now live in a world where people do believe that being called racist is the worst thing that you can be called, where some people absolutely believe that. Now, I, for one, do not agree. I do not agree with that. I think it's more important to learn to do better and be better. And when you make a mistake, and I know I do, I'm not perfect, own up to those mistakes and treat people like individuals, because they are. But I also know that's hard to do. And here's the thing, your mind wants to create shortcuts, and that makes it hard. So what's been especially interesting over the past 20 years is that we have kind of shifted from talking about these overt forms of prejudice. I don't need to tell you why it's not a good idea, to catcall a woman when she's on the street. I don't need to tell you that's probably not the best thing to do. Yes, some people enjoy it, but for other people, it's a pretty threatening experience. Now, most people know not to engage in outwardly sexist, racist, classist, homophobic, transphobic behavior. We all know not to do that, and most people will not do that. But we've kind of shifted our focus from the external behavior to internal implicit biases. And so one of the ways that you can actually test this, and look this up in Google if you are interested, it is called Project Implicit. Now, let's be clear. I have some issues with the implicit association test, but not because I think it isn't an opportunity for you to learn about the potential biases that exist within yourself. Yeah, no, that's exactly where it's from. It's Harvard's Project Implicit. So the thing about implicit biases is that a lot of these are transmitted by culture, by your upbringing. So if you have these implicit biases, I am not telling you you are a bad person. You are a part of a culture that favors certain groups of people over other groups of people in a wide variety of dimensions. But now that you're aware of those biases, I believe it's at that point, if you're aware of them, if we can make these unconscious, implicit things conscious, we now have an opportunity to override those thoughts and not let them affect our behavior. So the implicit association test is basically a way that we can look at implicit biases without social desirability coming into play. So for example, the standard task, and there are a bunch, by the way, you can look at implicit biases for women in science. You can look at one for body size, so how you feel about people who are overweight or obese compared to thin people. So there are a variety of them there. But the classic one is basically pairing pictures of what you have to do is pair white faces with positive words and then black faces with negative words. And then you switch it. You pair white faces with negative words and black faces with positive words. And we find that with those slight differences in response time, that we might be able to pinpoint an implicit bias. Maybe you have one, maybe you don't. But I would encourage you to give them a try. There are some issues with reliability, and that's my issue with it. It's not always reliable. They can sometimes be consciously controlled. But I would say check out Project Implicit if you're so inclined. Learn about what biases might be lurking within. We all have them, and it's not your fault. But if you know about them, you can do something about them. And that's maybe one way to make the world a better place. All right, folks, we will talk about everyday memory next time. Don't forget to turn in your recap of the War of the Ghosts, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.